Okay, I guess that's about time. So, hello everyone. You can all hear me out there, yes? Hi. Thank you. Um, Thank you for coming. Thank you to Cher and Republica for making this all happen. I'm very excited. I'm going to try to get through this. My natural speech rate is very fast. So if I'm going too fast, please wave at me in a sort of panicked way if you need me to slow down or go like this or something so that I don't lose you, because I'm trying to talk about some complicated things, and I don't want to lose too many people. So this is the actual name that my talk turned into in the time-honored tradition of submitting a title and then changing it later. This question of, is intimacy possible in global networks, and why should we care? So to start with, the concept of intimacy that I'm talking about here is cultural intimacy. And so I'm not talking about romantic or sexual intimacy or a kind of psychological, individualistic thing. I'm talking about a shared condition. It's something that happens between people, and especially in relation to identity. So what I'm thinking about is for people whose identities are not welcome in dominant society, if you're somebody who could be mocked or beaten or deported, for example, if your identity is public, you need a space where you can be intimate with others, where you can express who you are. Intimacy is important for everyone, but it's especially important in this context. This is what I'm interested in, because it plays into broader questions about power in society. So for me, this is why music is so important, especially for marginalized communities, because music generates and also reinforces intimacy between people. Cultural intimacy, because music builds on shared cultural references. So music doesn't really have meaning until it's heard and engaged with, and music comes from long traditions that are tied to cultural and social experiences. And so this is why music and nightlife are so important for all kinds of marginalized communities. So again, thinking about it in terms of different identities, right? Queer nightlife, gay bars, drag balls, right? These are really important places where people can express themselves in ways that they could not in other ways. Places where immigrants come together to play music from their homes, right? Whatever the content of the music, whatever the lyrics, it has political significance, it has a kind of intimacy because it's shared and it calls on older traditions. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about may be relevant in relation to various kinds of marginalized communities, but I'm going to start with the case study that comes from my own research. Maybe in the question section we can get into where else we can go with this. But my thinking really crystallized around the case of Jamaica and Jamaican popular music. And again, I was really interested in the role of globally networked technology, especially digital media technology. And so Jamaica is actually a really useful case study for this for several reasons. If you want to look at the relation of music and technology, Jamaica has a lot of music, and it has historically generated an incredible amount of music. So there's something to look at. But in relation to technology, what's interesting about Jamaica is many of the things that in the current climate people talk about as the result of digital technology have actually been true about Jamaica since the 1930s. So it's a really interesting case study of what it is that digital technology brings to Jamaica that wasn't there before. Because, for instance, people talk about digital media technology as opening up remote places to the globe, right? Oh, we have more access to faraway lands. Well, Jamaica, from the very beginning, right, was part of a global network. It is a former slave colony. Nothing about Jamaica as it is could have existed without a global network. Current networks of communication, both linguistic, right, the language people speak, and technological, are still built on the kinds of trade and patterns, right, that go back all the way to slavery times. The reason why Jamaicans emigrate first to the UK and Canada, right, as well as the US, right, has to do with this history. So it's already part of a global network. So we're not looking at how digital media, for example, integrates Jamaicans into a global network. They were already there. And then remix culture itself, right, which is something a lot of people talk about as being produced by the capabilities of digital technology. Right now we're able to reuse recordings. Jamaicans have been doing this since the 1930s with technology like this, the sound system. So popular music in Jamaica is based on not just reuse of musical content, but reuse of physical recordings. Again, going back to the beginning of the recording industry, the first Jamaican musical recordings were recordings of Jamaican singers singing on top of records that had been imported from the US, right? So from the very beginning, sampling reuse is happening in the Jamaican context. And I played you, right, one example of this, right, which this is also shows how this was embedded in the physical manifestation of recordings, which is that when people pressed a record, they would usually press an instrumental on the B-side because it was understood that it was raw material for other people to use, right? So on one side you would have the vocals and the music together, and on the other side you'd have the music alone, because when you bought the record, of course, you're probably going to sing on top of it or you're going to do something with it, right? So embedded into the physical nature of the recording media at the time was this idea of reuse and repetition. So digital media did not transform Jamaican practices in this way either. So the example, of course, the Stalag rhythm from 1974, we heard already. And just to give an example of some of the traditions, right, this is a famous one.
The thing called a bam bam, it was all Jamaican, with a different style, different fashion, you know? Tell me someone.
Right, so that's 1982, and then
Our sound boy acting your own funeral. This is also a burial. Original Butcher Banton on the bass. Watch the sound. Wanna hear me? Wanna hear me? Quick, so man.
right, that's 1992, right? So from 1974 to 1992, you have this tradition, and to the present day, because people are still, there's 279 versions at least of this song tracked. If you go to one particular website, you can look at a list of them, right? So just to say, again, what we're looking at when we look at the introduction of digital media technology into Jamaica is not remix culture, right? Is not integration into global networks. That's already happened. So why would we look at it? Well, for me, the question is, when looking at most things, how does it relate to existing inequality and power in society? So I don't think that technology is in itself a good or a bad thing. I think the only way to look at it is how does it relate to what's already happening, right? And there is in the world and in Jamaica and in the relations between Jamaica and the world a lot of inequality. And so what's interesting about digital technology in Jamaica is the way it interacts with some of these other systems. So what I'm going to do now is show you, alongside the reuse of recordings, excuse me, and alongside the global network, another thing that's really important in Jamaican music is the audience. And you could also talk about the way people talk about fan cultures now is this new idea, right? But the audience in Jamaica is pretty much the supreme arbiter of musical value in the popular music scene, in that if your song isn't big in these events, especially these street dances, which are outdoor parties that happen in Kingston and in all the cities, your song you aren't considered really an important part of the music scene. So you have to be big here. Even if you are foreign to a great extent, your song needs to be big here to be really integrated into the scene. And I'll talk more about why this matters in a second, but I'll just show you for a second, if the video works, a little bit about the dynamism of the audience, and we'll see more of it in a second. You can see all the dance moves like going back into the crowd, right? People are responding to the music all the way back here. They know the moves to the dances. They're responding. If they don't respond, This is a big message to the DJ and also to the producer of the song. So if your song flops here, you might not ever release it. A lot of DJs will, or producers will play a song in the dance, and if people don't like it, then they're not going to release it any further, right? So the audience really has some authority here. And one of the things that matters about that is the audience we're talking about here is the Jamaican poor. So poor people in Jamaica have a lot of cultural authority. And this is even though poor people in Jamaica otherwise, in terms of the elites in society, are looked down upon very much. So, and this plays out in racialized ways. That is, Jamaica is very much a racial hierarchy where the vast majority of society are black and about 2.5% are white. But in positions of power, it's mostly white and light-skinned people. And in positions of media authority, so radio announcers or TV announcers, all the way up to professors, right? You're much more likely to be light-skinned. And the images of dark-skinned people also tend to conform to particular stereotypes in dominant media. So what's interesting is that despite this kind of hierarchy, within the popular music scene, poor black Jamaicans are really the height of the authority in what's happening in the scene. And so what became interesting to me was trying to figure out what allows that to happen, right? How does that happen? And that has continued, that has been true since the 30s to now. Even though mainstream radio has avoided playing popular music from Jamaica, or in Jamaica, so Jamaican radio, official government radio, has avoided and always avoids playing the music that's popular among the poor until they're forced to. And there still is not, to this day, a music-only venue in the capital city of Jamaica. Okay, if you think about any stereotypes you might have about Jamaica, I will say one thing that is true is there is, again, a lot of music there. Music is really important. There is not a music-dedicated venue in the capital city, right? Which means the state does not fully trust, right, the role of music in society. They do not invest in it. There is not a giant, even a concert hall, right? There's plenty of music happening, but it doesn't happen in any official venue, right? It happens in other kinds of venues. So that exclusion is actually very interesting. And what I started to realize was that exclusion actually became a kind of source of power. Because what happened is because people couldn't participate in these official venues, they created their own spaces in the street in which they had authority that they couldn't have had in any other way. And so this is why some people call popular music in Jamaica and the street dance, which is the event I showed you the image of, a site for the repair of cultural injuries. Right? So again, cultural injuries meaning there's a hierarchy in the culture that looks down on poor folk, and this is the place you can go to assert yourself, to assert your style, right? Which is a very different style than upper class people have. And within Jamaica, within the street dance, this is considered, a height of fashion, right? You're creating your own style in a way that would not be popular if you were to go to the university, if you were to go to a government office, if you were to go to an office for an office job, right? This would not be the way you would be allowed to look. So I started thinking about what kinds of names, what kinds of concepts I could come up with or rely on that already exist to describe what allows this to happen. Again, what allows the dance to be this site where poor people can assert themselves in the face of a broader hostile environment. And what came out of some of the Jamaican scholars that I was reading was a concept called exilic space. So exilic space is from the word exile. And the idea is that the poor are to some extent exiles from Jamaican culture, but what they've done is take that and turn it into a site of their own authority. And this is possible, again, because it's an outside space, because it's a space that is not regulated. So they have been deliberately kept out of the mainstream and thus have been forced to find their own space. But what they've done in that space is they're less dependent on the mainstream for support. So if you look at where street dances happen, this is one of the most famous, which is Pasa Pasa. This is probably 4 a.m. on a Thursday morning. No, probably 6 a.m. And this is the street dance, right? So this kind of occupation of space could not happen in a wealthy neighborhood. It could only happen in a poor neighborhood. You couldn't have a street dance in a rich neighborhood. So again, the fact that it's a street dance, that it's outside, keeps the poor in authority, right? when you walk in poor neighborhoods, sometimes you'll see just a tower of speakers on the street, right? Which is waiting for the party later in the night, right? This would not be, you wouldn't see this in a rich neighborhood, right? And so a lot of what's happening in this space is things that are illegal, violations of noise regulations, right? Also, people are selling food and alcohol. It's not licensed, that's illegal. Sometimes people are consuming other kinds of substances that are not legal, right? All kinds of things are happening in this space that could not happen in another kind of space. Also, in relation to music, people are doing things which are improper or illegal, right? So the reuse of musical recordings also happens with recordings that don't come from Jamaica. So, for example, this Neo song, which many of you may know. Any song that's big in the US that crosses over to Jamaica eventually is going to be reused and reinterpreted in Jamaica. Right? So this is Independent Woman. And this is what happened to it. So Vibes Cartel and Spice did this version.
Me cocky longer than me night. Tell me what you like. You want me try or you want to ride it like a bike?
I don't know how many of you can follow patois, but they took a song which is about a woman who's financially independent, and they made it into an extremely explicit, an exuberant interaction between a man and a woman talking about having sex in very graphic terms, with both the male voice and the female voice present. And so there's two ways, right, that this is improper. One is that the sexual explicitness caused an enormous backlash in Jamaica. There was a tremendous outcry about how improper this was. They also reused the American song without permission, right? So it was improper use of intellectual property as well as an improper sort of behavior. But what's interesting is that within the street dance, these practices are both legitimate, right? It's a legitimate tradition to reuse music, and it's also legitimate to talk explicitly about sex. And so, in fact, Spice, in the ensuing controversy, says, look, actually, it's not misleading. It doesn't lead kids astray. It's actually a man and a woman talking about what they like to do, which is, in fact, a kind of conversation that probably people should have, right? This is what I like. This is what you like. Why don't you try this thing that I like? Why don't you try that thing, right? Like, that's actually not a bad conversation to have. So she says, look, it's basically sex education. So what she's asserting is that within the context of her culture, right, the poor folks' culture, there's another set of values around sex, and that she thinks that that's actually not a bad thing. And she can only do that because there is this space in which that can be asserted, right? Because you can't actually, in Jamaica, bring this song. I mean, I'm not even sure if they have a lot of sex education in schools, but this isn't a song you could bring in. The head of the school system called it musical poison, right? So you can see the contrast of values here. Another way that this is asserting its sort of autonomy from the dominant system can be thought of in terms of race and also colonialism, in that a lot of the dancing, which is considered also very improper, both can be read, as Spice would have it, as a kind of expression of sexual autonomy and sexual assertiveness, but also it calls on traditions of African dance in which body parts like the butt are not considered to be dirty things. So if we had time, I would show you, and I can post these links anywhere or put them on Twitter or whatever anyone wants. But I mean, there are just endless videos from all over different parts of Africa, from Cuba, all of these dance moves in which people are doing, basically ass-centric dance moves, right? Often women doing them together, men doing them together. Like, it's very much about a set of practices that isn't necessarily about having sex, but it's about asserting a kind of power in your own body. And so many people, and I've sort of talked about some of them here, Janelle Hobson wrote a great book called The Baddie Politic about this. Baddie means ass. Talking about how what's happening in these dances is a part of an Afrocentric tradition, right? So and there's some great discussion of this online that I'm happy to point folks to. So again, improper activities, improper bodies are happening within the street dance, as well again as improper intellectual property practices. So these practices all together are what generate cultural intimacy. They generate shared values in the street dance that would be looked down on in broader society. And what I started to feel was that there was a way in which the localness of the street dance, the fact that you have to go there, really mattered, right? That is, that it's not that there were no foreigners there. If you saw the video, there was a couple Japanese folks in the audience. But again, you had to be at the street dance in order to be a part of it. This doesn't mean they're isolated, again, because Jamaican music has been in global circulation for a long time. But I would argue that before the digital era, the conditions of its circulation were exilic. And what I mean by that is that the first wave of Jamaican music circulated among immigrants, Jamaican immigrants, the ska era, and circulated then among working class youth who were rebellious in the UK. And so it had a kind of cultural boundary around it. There was something that was considered disruptive about the music, so that you were disruptive if you listened to it. The second wave of Jamaican music, right, in the 70s with reggae, coincided with the rise of indigenous resistance movements all over the world. This is part of what made reggae global. And with Antifa movements, for example, in Europe, right? So a lot of how reggae spread in Europe had to do with politics as well as loving the music. Interestingly, this is not true in the US. Reggae has a completely different cultural significance in the US and is not exilic. And you can see it if you go to reggae parties in the US. But the conditions under which it circulated before the digital era, I think, kept it connected more to some of its subversive and resistant history. So what's changed? Well, one of the things that's changed now is the rise of especially visual media in the street dance. So there are video cameras and, of course, camera phones and video cameras on phones all over Jamaica, and people are filming the street dance, Jamaicans too, and putting these images online, putting the videos online, selling the DVDs, circulating the DVDs. And what I came to believe was that although there are ways in which this is an advantage, certainly artists want to be famous and people build their reputations in certain ways, there's also ways in which being seen can be a harm. And especially when you're thinking about these broader ideas about sexuality, about racial imagery, and how people are presented when they're taken out of their local context. And especially with visual media, it's really easy to turn off the sound and create your own story for what's happening. It's more accessible in some ways without a lot of the cultural meaning attached to it, especially when you're talking about bodies. So one of the most obvious examples of this is that there are now series of videos of just upskirt shots, right, of cameras looking up women's dresses while they're dancing, or just focusing on breasts and butts at the street dance. And they're in the porn section of the video, the little video shops, not necessarily in the music section, assuming they're separate, which in some cases they're not. But still, they're marketed, right, they call it the punani cam sometimes, right? So all of these kinds of dances that have significance in the street dance, in which they are, I think, kinds of cultural autonomy, connections to African traditions, become reinterpreted in a different way as the images travel. Another very interesting development in recent years in Jamaica has to do with the way that male performers are presenting themselves. And Vybz Kartel, who you heard already, is a great example of this, which is that it's not that skin bleaching is new in Jamaica, but it is actually new for male pop performers to be really obvious about bleaching their skin and to talk about it, which Vybz Kartel has done. So it's the same guy, right? But he's changed his appearance. This is not only a trick of the light. He is really substantially lighter than he used to be. And he talks about it. He talks about how he sees himself as an entertainer on the global stage, and he's chosen to alter his appearance in this way, in the way that women get, he says explicitly, like women get breast implants, men get hair plugs. You know, he's like, I'm altering my appearance the way performers do. And I can't really disagree with that, but I would say, why now? What is it that's making this be part of what it means to be a performer now? And one of the things is that the eyes of the broader media world are on these local spaces in a way they were not before. So it used to be, in my idea, more of a local kind of autonomy around imagery and around identity that was centered in the lives and the likenesses of the poor. And now even those spaces are on the global stage, right? And the global stage, to be real, is a white supremacist stage overall. And so this is a reflection of that. I'm not saying that Vibes Cartel is a dupe or is brainwashed or anything like that, right? He's dealing with the pressures of the system, but he's been integrated into a system on different terms than it used to be. Just to highlight briefly, because I used to be a copyright law scholar as well, of course you have also pressures from copyright law when video and audio circulate in broader networks. So this thing on the bottom right here is Audible Magic, right, which is what YouTube has embedded in it, where it compares the audio file of an uploaded video to a database of copyrighted material, and then it flags it or takes it down. Again, a lot of Jamaican music is based on reuse. So any kind of music that is flagged as copyright violating is disadvantaged in this system, right? And of course, we know that Sony and other kind of content industry people would like to embed this kind of thing on your computer. Up here is an audio production software that you can integrate with SoundCloud, but that also means that when you integrate it with SoundCloud, you integrate it with Audible Magic, which means that even your production process ends up having copyright scanning in it, right? So the impropriety, the violation of property that happens in the musical practices are also disadvantaged when they get integrated into this broader system. So just to recap, right, some of the harms that I'm talking about are this idea that you can be taken out of your local context and put in another context, right, in a white supremacist media context. To go back to the images of women, it's not that being turned into porn, whether you want to or not, it's not that that's automatically bad, although it sounds pretty bad actually, but it's also right that the kinds of images of black women's bodies that exist in the broader media world are very limited already and tend to reinforce the idea that black women are sexualized objects without personalities, right? So contributing to that is problematic, right? And then of course, in general, the people who tend to be advantaged in these systems are the ones who conform more to the dominant way of making music, the dominant way of performing, right? So that replicates historic relationships of dominance. White-looking, white-acting folks, right, are going to do better in this system. And not only white in terms of skin color, right, but again, conforming to the cultural assumptions that copyright law has within it, which was written by colonizers. So there's a set of nuances in there that I don't want to leave out. So, to take it back to technology, my point is that if you're designing media platforms, if you're designing software, if you're designing hardware that can have this stuff embedded in it, not only do you need to think about how access works, about how you're going to get people to have access to new markets, to promote themselves, to spread themselves, to get more eyes on their work, but you need to think about actually what it's going to do for people who face certain kinds of harms, people who need intimacy, right? Granting somebody access or exposure when that could get them killed, when that could get them mocked, when that can turn them into a kind of joke or a kind of racial fetish, right? That might be something you want to think about. If people are dependent on exilic spaces, is your technology just going to destroy the exilic nature of that space or not? What can you do about that? That would be my question. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Sorry, guys. So do we have time for questions? 1 minute. Anyone want to jump in? Yes? Who organizes the street dances was a question. So it's hard to say for sure, but it happens in a local community, and so there might be a local sound crew, a sound system crew that wants to do it, but they have to coordinate, they have to get the community to agree, because it's just literally on a sidewalk. But often in poor communities, they're a real source of money, because people can sell food and beer and whatever, and it's also socially fun and nice to express yourself. So, but it's definitely a sort of negotiation among a group. And often they do end up also being affiliated to local, not gangsters isn't quite the right word, but like local unofficial businessmen who either are underwriting some of the drinks and this kind of thing, or also are running interference for the police, because lots of illegal stuff happens, and occasionally the police will wander through, but they don't actually seem to enforce. I've never seen them enforce anything, although I've seen them there when people were selling marijuana and violating zoning laws and all this kind of thing. So there's some kind of negotiations happening among all of these groups. Sorry, can you say that again? Interesting. Parallels with New Orleans. You mean like the New Orleans bounce scene? Yeah, I think that's a great connection. So there is a lot of discussion around New Orleans bounce, which is also a sort of dance style which is highly sexualized, focuses on the butt, and there's people who talk about it as being seen as a kind of freak show, like when it leaves its home. I mean, some of the question there is about who the people are who take it out. So the fact that there's actual New Orleans artists going around, to me, makes it a more interesting question than if it was, say, a DJ who wasn't from there playing the music out. But I think you're right to say that we might consider those questions because it's a music that's a refuge for queer, genderqueer, performers who are involved in a lot of other kinds of subterranean cultures. And what does it mean to get exposure? Yeah, I think that's really that would be a great parallel. Yes. Have to do that now? Well, come talk to me later if you need to. Thank you guys very much.